Agnieszka. Very happy to be here again for the EU Open Data Explained training. We had the meeting 2 weeks ago for the first one, so I guess that some of you have been in that meeting as well. So this is the follow-up on that, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into how DCAT and DCAT-AP work. First of all, the learning objective for today, I want to talk to you a little bit about the concept of linked data, introduce the linked data vocabularies that are used in DCAT and DCAT-AP, and then go into the way that DCAT-AP defines mandatory, recommended, and optional classes and properties. Then have a list of the controlled vocabularies used in DCAT-AP, and then the second part of the presentation, we'd like to look at some examples and also some guidelines for issues that sometimes come up in discussions with developers. So first of all, the resource description framework, RDF, you have seen in the reading list some specifications of that. I think it's interesting to look at this for a couple of minutes, because DCAT is defined as an RDF vocabulary, and also DCAT-AP follows that lead, and therefore a couple of basic notions of the resource description framework to understand a little bit better how this works. RDF is a W3C recommendation from 2014, and it defines what is called the basic graph structure. A graph in I think mathematical theory has nodes and edges. The nodes are the things, the entities that are relevant for the RDF descriptions, and the edges are the relationships. They're called predicates in RDF. So on the right-hand side, in the gray box, this is the basic concept, the basic notion of RDF. You have subjects and you have objects, and the relation between them are predicates. That is called a triple in that box. And an example of that would be you have a data set, which is the subject. It has a publisher, which is the predicate, and the object is an organization that publishes that data set. And the organization has a name, and the name is the publications office. So that's another triple that is defined in RDF. So the subject and object, these colored ovals here, are classes of things, so books, places, or persons, and the predicates are the properties of those things. For example, the names, the dates, and the relation between things. So the subject and object are the things that you want to say something about, and the properties are the things that you want to say about them, what they are, how they are related. So an important thing that sometimes comes up in the context of RDF is things and strings. In the gray box, you can see that there are two nodes, a subject and an object, in the graph, and those can be either references to things, a URI, an identifier. It could be an anonymous thing, which is called a blank node, or it could be a string, a literal. It could be a string, it could be text, it could be a number, things like that, that are let's say, the end of the line. The interesting thing about the way that RDF is able to build complex structures out of such a very simple scheme. In the bottom, you can see something that is called the follow your nose principle, where you have, in this case, a data set, which is the thing, and you see on top of that, there is an identifier for it. And then you have the has publisher property to an organization. You can see there is a URI, an identifier for that organization as well, which is also a thing. And then it has a name, which is the publications office, which is a string. So in fact, from this very simple way of making statements, you can actually create whole chains of statements, and that is called in the IDF speak the follow your nose principle. Another thing that comes up in IDF is domains and ranges. A predicate has a domain, which is the subject, and a range, which is the object. The domain that tells you what kind of thing may have this property, and the range is to what other things this thing is related. An example here, a very simple example, is about the eye color of a person, where you could have a triple where the object where the subject is a person, the predicate has eye color, and the object is the color. So you have the domain of this has eye color is the person, the range is the color. Now this is something that can be defined in RDF, and it can say what kind of things can have eye color. So on the bottom, the example, RDF would say that you cannot provide the eye color to cars. And that is something that if you look at an RDF definition, you would see for a property a domain and a range that tells you how that property can be used. Those declarations, as I say, the way that properties are defined and how they are related to things, are defined in what is called namespaces. Now, this is something that is basically a documentation issue, where you can have a set of specifications that belong together. For example, RDF itself has a namespace, DCAT has a namespace, and something like the doubling core, a basic RDF vocabulary, also has a namespace. You can see the namespace URIs in the middle part basically give you the location where you can actually find that namespace. So the specification, if you need it, you can go there and see what it is. Those URIs, those identifiers, are basically locations on the web, so that you can actually look it up. And that's one of the important parts of RDF, that RDF uses the web as its context. So you can see those things there. And also, if you use them in your metadata, you would use those namespace URIs to identify the things that you're talking about. On the right-hand side, you see a common prefix for those vocabularies. That is something that you will see later in some of the examples. So that's rather than having to copy every time the whole namespace URI, you can use a prefix that identifies that namespace. So in those namespace specifications, you will have declarations, definitions of the things that this namespace defines. And that, for example, for the properties, it would also include the domain and ranges for those properties. So you can actually look it up and see what are the valid connections for the properties. It's not always there. It is not always necessary to have that. So you could have properties that don't have a defined domain or a defined range. In that case, it means that you can use it for anything. For example, in DCAT, there are some of the properties that have a domain of dataset. But for example, in doubling core, the properties don't have domains. It means that you can apply them to anything. You're not restricted to provide, to apply those properties to specific things. And you can do that, you can see that in various namespaces, that there are sometimes domains and ranges defined, and sometimes they're not. In RDF descriptions, one thing that is also important, that you can freely mix namespaces in a description. So you can use some DCAT properties, you can some Dublin core properties, and you can mix and match that all together. DCAT actually does that. DCAT is a specification that provides some properties for itself, so DCAT properties, but it also relies on other RDF vocabularies to describe things. For example, apart from the DCAT properties themselves, DCAT uses a lot Dublin core, and I guess that many people will know what Dublin core is. A general purpose vocabulary for basic properties. So, for example, titles, descriptions, publisher are things that are defined in Dublin core. It's basically things that came from a library domain where you describe things in this way with titles and descriptions. The second one that is being used in DCAT is FOAF, originally the friend of a friend vocabulary, which is a very simple vocabulary to describe people and organizations and their relationships. It was initially intended for description of relationship in social media, but it also has possibility to link people to organizations, for example, in terms of employment. The third one is SCOS, a simple knowledge organization system, which has a vocabulary that defines and describes things like thesauri, taxonomies, and other controlled vocabularies. For example, including properties like broader and narrower, where you can make relationships between concepts. This is also used in DCAT for describing the subjects, for example, of datasets. And the last one here, and that's it's only a selection, those four. The last one here is the VCAT vocabulary, which is a vocabulary to describe people and organizations, specifically focusing on their location information. So it was initially intended to describe business cards on the web, but at the moment it also allows the description of more elaborate information about organizations and people. So those four are the main ones that are being used in DCAT, and you will see later on how they are used and what that means in terms of the expression of descriptions in DCAT. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about the constraints in DCAT-AP. If you remember from the first webinar, we talked about the difference between DCAT as a core vocabulary, as a standard, and DCAT-AP as a specification that applies that base standard to a particular application, the application being the aggregation of data sets in data portals in Europe. The official title of DCAT-AP is also contains that description with the application profile for data portals in Europe. And what it does, it provides some more detail on how to use DCAT. If you see here those little boxes on the right-hand side, those are copies from the specification of DCAT-AP, where it identifies the things that are mandatory. So if you implement DCAT-AP, those are the kind of things that you need to provide. So it says you need to be able to describe the catalog. You need to be able to describe datasets. And you need to be able to describe agents. And the agents are being used for the publisher, for example, of a catalog, which is something that is required in the description. So these details are described in DCAT-AP, and it also describes the properties that you need to provide for the description. So in the case of a catalog, the catalog needs to have a title, it needs to have a description, it needs to have a publisher, and it has datasets associated with it. For datasets, you need to provide the title and the description, and for a distribution, you need to provide an access URL. So It might well be that people say, well, this is really, really very minimal. The issue there when we were doing the development of DCAT-AP was that we tried to find out what everybody could provide. And because there were different organizations involved, with different levels of maturity, I could say, we came up with a very small set of mandatory properties. It's a very basic set of descriptors. That's true. It's no question about that. Things that every system should be able to support. But of course, there is a problem if you only have that, then the functionality that you can provide in the portal is very limited. You search for data sets and you can get to the data, but there is not much detail that you can have there. So what DCAT-AP also did was it defined some recommended elements. So those are the kind of things that you really would need to provide, if at all possible. That's, I think, the way that we formulated that. And then, so you're adding things to the mandatory part. It would be good if you can provide categories of data sets, if you can provide distributions, and that's something that you might be interested in seeing, that a distribution of a data set is not mandatory, and we'll come back to that at the end of the training. And also a license document. It would be very useful to provide information about the license for the reuse of the data sets. And then in the properties that can be added as recommended, in the catalog, very often there is a homepage of the catalog where you can find more information. The languages that are contained in the catalog, the license for the reuse of the catalog, and a theme taxonomy, which is sort of a subject vocabulary of what the data sets are about. In dataset, it's recommended to provide a contact point, so you can give feedback or pose questions about datasets, having a distribution, keyword, publisher, and the theme, which is the subject of the dataset. For distributions, it is very helpful to have a description to provide the information about the format of the distribution and then the reuse license. And for the data service, you remember that was an addition in DCAT version 2 for description of endpoints, and there you would have the endpoint description and also a description of what data sets are being served by the data service. So if you provide those information, and this information that very many implementers would be able to provide, then you can have more advanced functionality in a portal that brings DCAT AP descriptions together. For example, in your user interface, you can provide functions to filter on the subjects, on the themes, filter on the language of data sets, if you're only interested in a particular language, or you can see which publishers have provided the data sets, and then you can have these more navigation or search functions that will help people to understand better what those data sets are about. Now, in addition to the recommended elements that provide you with some better functionality, you would also be able to add things that are called optional elements. Things that are, I would say, nice to have. Maybe not all the publishers of the descriptions of datasets would be able to provide those, but if you have them, that would be useful to exchange them, to provide them, so that people can have even more functionality, but only maybe on a limited amount of datasets. Some examples there, you can have a catalog record. We described it, that was also in the first webinar, explained that a catalog record describes the metadata of a dataset. And you can do that I know that in the Publications Office, those catalog records are used, but not in all catalogues there is this function of describing information about the metadata. So this is something that is optional. If you really need it, it will provide it. Then if you look at the properties, and there's a small selection because DCAT-AP has quite a lot of optional elements. You can, for example, provide the creator of the catalog, the organization, the person that was responsible for creating it. For datasets, I highlight here version information, so you can provide information about what the history of a dataset is and which version it is. For distributions, one thing that people really need sometimes is being able to provide compression formats. So large files can be compressed with a particular compression algorithm. And for data services, you could also have access rights and licenses. So it's important to understand that these might not be always available. So also if you look at the DCAT-AP implementations, there are some of them that will provide that information. In some cases, you remember from the first webinar, if there are national extensions to DCAT-AP, or in the case of Publications Office, the DCAT-AP, those things might be available because they are important for the local user interface or the local portal. And if they are available locally, then it is possible to also share them wider through DCAT-AP. So those are the mandatory, recommended, and optional elements. One thing important for DCAT-AP is also the values of the metadata. So you can see that there are fields or descriptive properties in DCAT-AP for which it would be very useful to have a limited number of values of the metadata elements. For example, very simple examples are, you don't want to have people to type in the name of a country, for example, or the name of a language. It's much easier for people to provide, for example, to a drop-down list, a selection of the values, which then can be encoded in such a way that it is interoperable. So a common set of value would be useful to provide, to make things interoperable, and therefore DCAT-AP makes it mandatory to use particular controlled vocabularies. One example is the classification of data sets. I said that there is this concept schemes and the subjects, the themes that are being used is in DCAT-AP is mandatory use of the EU vocabulary data theme. That is a list of 13 values, for example, agriculture, education, economy, transport. So 13 values that can be used, which then can be used by the European Data Portal to give you this overview of which topics are being described in data sets, and you can filter on a particular topic. Data theme is just one example. There are several of them. Frequency for identifying how often a data set is refreshed. Languages, file types, for example, whether it's a PDF or an Excel file. One of the things that we found out also in DCAT-AP is it's very useful to have a common set of values, but in some cases, on the national level, there might be already national theme vocabularies that are different from the common data theme vocabulary. This means that sometimes there needs to be a mapping. If people have national DCAT-AP data, they might need to convert their themes to the themes that are commonly known. Some countries I know have immediately adopted the 13 data themes from the EU level, other countries are doing a mapping from their national vocabulary to the European one. We see here all the EU vocabularies that are used by DCAT-AP, and especially also by DCAT-AP at the Applications Office for the EU Open Data Portal. Running through them here, the access rights, which identify whether something is public or restricted, for example. The corporate body vocabulary has the names of EU institutions. The countries, of course, all the countries in the world where data sets can be referred to. Data themes, the 13 topics of data sets. Data status, whether it's under development or completed. Dataset type is a vocabulary that, for example, contains values for geospatial data or for statistical data, those kind of types. Distribution types for downloadable files or visualizations, for example, is another distribution type. Then we have documentation type, saying whether a document is the main description of a data set or or it is a related documentation. Eurovoc is the vocabulary that has all the activities of the EU that can be used as subjects for information in data sets. File types, like it's PDF or an Excel file. Frequency, daily updates or weekly updates. The languages, licenses, which include, for example, Creative Commons licenses. Notation type gives you information about what codes are. For example, there is a notation type for a digital object identifier so that you understand what a particular code is about. And time periods, whether it's months or years or quarters, and those are the kind of things that are being used for DCAT-AP and DCAT-AP-OP. You can see, for example, there was a question in the first webinar of what the rules are for publishing these controlled vocabularies. And an example here from the Publications Office for the data theme vocabulary, you can see that the Publications Office publishes those controlled vocabularies in multiple formats. There is two that you can see here. In this case, if you have a very small screen, you might not be able to see that. But on the left-hand side, you have SCOS, the Simple Knowledge Organization System, in RDF and then expressed in XML, which is one thing that people are doing. And you can see on the first part, there is a description of the concept scheme, which is the vocabulary as a whole. It has a name, a data theme, and it has an identifier. And then on the bottom, you can see with all these languages, there is the description of one of the codes, which is the agriculture code, and you have here with 27 languages what it means. On the right-hand side, you have a pure XML expression of the same vocabulary, and also there you have on the top the description of the vocabulary itself, and then again for one of the themes, the agricultural theme, you have also the description in different languages, and even in the XML you have more information. At the bottom you actually see a larger description of the item of the concept. So that's to say that an organization that publishes controlled vocabularies, like the Publications Office, has the possibility to publish them in many different formats, so that it can be used in different contexts. That's first part. Any questions that you want to raise?
Yes, Max, thank you for the first part of the presentation. And the first question is about domain and range from Carlos. Isn't I a subject itself? I think it concerns the examples you had on the slides.
Yes, of course. You can. The idea is in RDF you can actually decide what you think is the important thing to describe. You could actually say that the eye has a color. The example that I gave was linking it directly to a person, but you could actually say a person has eyes, and eyes have a color. So there's a different way of describing that, but in fact, an eye is also a thing, and an eye could have, as an entity, could also have a URI, and you could also make that play into that graph structure.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Alice Irena. The difference between an URI and URL.
Well, yeah, I think the difference, there are some differences. A URI is an identifier, and a URL is a locator. A URL is, in fact, also a URI, but there are also URIs that are not URLs. Maybe people have heard about uniform resource name, which is something different, which is not a URL, but more well, it's an identifier. So if you have, in this case, if you look at DCAT-AP, if you look at things that play a role in big data with RDF, then usually you can say that they're the same. They look the same. They have a different purpose. A URL is really where you will find something. And a URI is something how you refer to something. And it might be very subtle, that difference. In many cases, it would not really be a difference in practice, but there is a slight difference in objective of the two, although you will see in all the examples that we have here that all the URIs that I have on the slide look like URLs. So there is actually a standard for URI that identifies what kind of things could be URIs, and URL is one of them.
Okay, and thank you. Next question from Xavier. Could we consider as data service an IT service that dereferences some URIs, for example, with XML JSON for machines and or HTML pages for humans?
Well, yes. Well, in fact, the data service is something a little bit more, let's say, powerful. What you're addressing here is you have something that you want to show to a machine in a certain format and show to a person in another format, which is basically, it could be the file that you're looking at. A data service usually works with a search interface, let's say an API. You can ask the data service certain things. It's not necessarily directly to a particular file, but you could actually have a service that is flexible in being able to provide different views, for example, of data, combine data from different places. So data service is a little bit more, let's say, powerful than just providing different formats to different applications. But the data service could do that. But in fact, what you're looking at is usually more like what people would call an API, where you can ask questions and then get results.
Okay, and the question from Stefano. Could you please explain a bit more the usage of the concept class of classes? For example, they apply only to domains and ranges or also to properties grouped in classes? Should classes be defined? How?
Well, yeah, of course, the class is sort of the central entity for RDF. Properties are also part of a class of properties. I use the notion here a little bit more, let's say, less strict. We usually see that we have the classes that we use for the subject and the objects are things. We in sort of the formal language of RDF, properties are also part of the property class. So in that sense, it goes a little bit too far, I think, for this training to explain that further. But just for this point, remember that you have things that you want to describe, which are classes of things, and then you have properties that give you characteristics of those things. And then we might leave the issue of what exactly is a class and how does a class relate to properties, maybe for a future training.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think these are all the questions for this part. So
Okay.
I invite everybody for a coffee break. So it will be 5 minutes. So see you at 10:43 back.
Okay.
Okay, 10:43, and we start with the second part of the presentation. Max, please.
Yes, okay. So let's continue. In the second part of the presentation, I will give you a couple of examples of what DCAT-AP descriptions look like. I am going to provide two examples. You need to understand that the metadata that you're going to see is a little bit edited and simplified to bring out the point that I wanted to bring to your attention. One example is the EU Open Data Portal, something that was, of course, developed within the context of DCAT-AP and especially DCAT-AP-OP. And the other example that I'm going to show to you after that is an example that was not part of DCAT-AP, but was done directly for DCAT at W3C. To start with the examples, what you're going to see here is RDF expressed in what is called Turtle, a expression format that is a little bit easier for people to read than what sometimes is done with an expression in XML. Usually people understand better what happens when they look at the Turtle one. So I wanted to just give you some impression of what those descriptions look like. So first of all, I'll start with the catalog, and then I'll do the data set and the distribution for the EU Open Data Portal. First of all, you can see here on the first line that there is an identifier, EUODP, which is an invented identifier, which is a DCAT catalog. So there's this declaration that the thing that we're describing here is a catalog. You can see that there are two titles. One question in the previous webinar was, how do you can do multilingual information? So this is the way you do it. You can repeat the DCT title, which is the governing core title, if you remember from earlier slide, that is the prefix for governing core. So you have two titles, one in English and one in French. Then you have two descriptions, also in English and French. In fact, in the reality, the Open Data Portal supports more languages, all the official languages of the EU. But for demonstration purposes, I limited that a little bit here. There is a publisher, which is, you can see here, a URI for the Publications Office, the UCPDL. And then it has data sets, three data sets in this example, and I'll come back to one of them later in the example. And those blue ones that you can see here are all things that are mandatory in DCAT-AP. The green ones are recommended in DCAT-AP. The homepage of the EU Open Data Portal, the languages, and there in real fact you have a whole list of languages that are supported, a license for the catalog, and then the theme taxonomy, as I also in the previous part showed, is the data theme taxonomy. And one thing that you can see here, I think in the publisher field, in the language fields, in the license and the theme taxonomy, all of those use control vocabularies. They all use control vocabularies from the EU vocabularies. And that's important to note, that those fields are not just free text that people can fill in. No, they are taken from the control vocabularies to make it interoperable. We don't go into the data set, the actual one about the COVID data around Europe. And again, here you can see here we have four groups here, the mandatory ones, recommended ones, that we have two that are optional in DCAT-AP, and then there are some local editions which are in the DCAT-AP-OP, but not in the DCAT-AP that is used across Europe. Again, there you can see there's two titles. There's a description. I just represented one here. There is a contact point here, and the way that you can see that here is a blank note, as it's called. We had that earlier in the example where I said that these subjects can be identified by an identifier or can be a blank note. This is a blank note, and we can come back to that later and also maybe in the next webinar. Here there are two distributions, which we'll see later on. Again, there is a publisher, in this case, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. With their URI here, there is a theme, which is that it's about health. It has a landing page. It has, in the optional ones, it says how often it is updated, weekly. And there's also a forward page here. The interesting thing is you can actually link to other information that is useful for this. And in this case, it is actually a link to a YouTube video about a EU datathon that it was dedicated to COVID-19. So that is something that is useful if you have this data set that can actually also see what how it was created, how it was used. And then there is local editions. There is a subject which identifies something in Eurovoc, namely respiratory diseases. And there is also in the Publications Office a link to applications that use the data set. There is a dashboard that uses this data set. And it actually says also that as part of the catalogue, the EU ODP. So the Publications Office also has catalogue records. You can see one here that describes the information that we just saw, the metadata of the data set. You can see here this is the first line. It says it's a catalogue record. It says when it was modified, which is a mandatory field in DCAT-AP, and also what its primary topic is. So it points back to the information about dataset number one. It also has a recommended property the DCT issued, which is the time and date that it was initially published. And then the Publications Office also has local editions to identify what the number of downloads and the number of views. Coming back to the distributions, there was in the dataset description a link to two distributions, and you can see here the two above and below the line. Both are defined as DCAT distribution. They have, because it's mandatory in DCAT-AP, access URL. So that's the place where you go if you want to access the data. You can see they're different because they're in different locations. Then it has a description, the format. In this case, one is a JSON file, and the other is an XML file. And this property provides that information. They both have the same license, the Creative Commons Attribution license, and they are both in the DC type, in the optional field in DCAT-AP, described as a downloadable file. So you can see here, you can have those informations. You have in all the descriptions the things that are mandatory, things that are recommended, optional, and sometimes you also have local extensions. But the other example is a little bit different because it is a project that was looking at interoperability for environmental information. It's a project that was done by the Italian Research Council in the EENV Plus project, and you can see at the bottom of the slides, you can see a link to that project. The interesting thing was, as I said earlier, it's not developed in the context of DCAT-AP. it was developed in the context of DCAT for W3C. If you remember from the first webinar, I said that a standard W3C, a recommendation, can only go to the status of recommendation if you have an implementation report. And this example, I have derived that from the implementation report that was submitted to W3C by this project as a demonstration that DCAT version 2 at W3C was used. So we'll see that there are certain things that are in line with DCAT-AP and certain things that might be outside of DCAT-AP. Again, going through these different entities, starting with the catalog. You can see here, this is a DCAT catalog. It has a title, description, it has a publisher, it has datasets associated with it, like 2 in this example. It has a home page. It uses a theme taxonomy, and the interesting thing here is the theme taxonomy is not the EU vocabulary, because they were not part of that network. They have they use the Wikipedia categories to characterize data sets. So in that sense, if you have a different network of cooperating organizations, you can select the theme taxonomy that works best for you. It has, in this case, it also has a service, a data service, which is linked to, and we get back to the description of that data service later. It has the DCP rights, and the interesting thing here, even if they weren't part of the DCAT-AP network, they still use some of the EU vocabularies. In this case, the access rights, they use the public element, the public term from the EU vocabulary. They have a link that actually those red ones at the bottom are things that have been added in DCAT-AP version 2. PC is referenced by to identify an article that was written that used that referred to the catalog, and it also has a landing page for the catalog. One of the data sets then for the Leicester Earth Thesaurus data set, what you can see here is a data set. It has this identifier Earth 2014-0604. Again, comparing it to DCAT-AP, it uses all the things that are defined in DCAT-AP, mandatory, recommended, optional, titles, description. In this case, you can see the DCAT contact point is actually URI, so it was something that is defined elsewhere and can be reused in this way, so you don't have, like in the other example, a blank node. You actually have an identified node. There are 2 distributions. There are keywords, there's a publisher, and in the catalog it was said that people would use the Wikipedia classifications, and you can see here that it uses a thesaurus as defined by Wikipedia. Various other things, dates were issued, dates were modified. One thing that here you can see there's also a landing page for the thesaurus. It's referenced, the data set is referenced also by an article that has a DOI. And also on the bottom you can see that there is something that is new in DCAT, is the way that you can express relationships with things. And in this case, they use this qualified relation to identify that this particular data set is a revision of an earlier data set. You can see at the bottom you have the add goal, revision of, and that relates it to another data set which has an identifier which is 2013-0604. So this is something that is added by this data set from DCAT-AP. If you then look at the distribution, one of the distributions, all of it is from DCAT-AP, apart from a local edition. So you can see they use the DCAT access URL, the DCP license for the reuse licenses, and that they use directly, not the EU vocabulary, but directly the link to Creative Commons. They have a media type, which is defined by the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, where they say it's link data and JSON, usually referred to as JSON OD, modified title, and then they have a local edition, which comes from another IDF vocabulary, devoid, where you can actually have fields that describe vocabularies. They use here URI space that gives you a shorthand for all the entities that I described fit into that namespace. So that is something that is added, which is not available in DCAT-AP and not available in DCAT either. So it's an extra thing that they have added. So there's also a data service there. The catalog points to that. And it describes here that it's a data set, that it's a data service. It has a title, it has an endpoint URL. So you can actually click on that and you go there, you can have the access to the data service. You can go there and then get access to those two datasets, the datasets that were also the previous slides as an example. Again, the data service is publicly available. There's a description for that. It describes, it gives you information about what it conforms to. So there is a service in JSP, which is the way that you can access that data service. And also it has a contact point, which is the description here, which has an identifier. And this would be described separately, and you could go there and find out about that. So far the examples. You might have questions, but as you know, you can put them in the chat. We'll come back to them later. I just wanted to address three things that sometimes people have difficulties understanding or applying. One of them is, what is it about access URL and download URL? Both are available for distributions, and it's not always clear what they are and when you use them. So what we know is that in the description and the definition in DCAT at W3C is that access URL is a more general one. Access URL may link to a downloadable file, but not necessarily. So it could also link to a page with more information. And the download URL must link to a downloadable file. So in fact, if you receive information about the distribution and you see a download URL, that is something, if you click on that, then you actually get the data. If you have an access URL, it might not always go to the data. In DCAT-AP, the specification of that, there was a discussion about which ones to use. And the decision was that it would be more consistent to have one of them mandatory. So that if you have an application that receives data, you will always know that there is an access URL. Otherwise, you would have to have some information about what to do if there's no access URL. Is there a download URL? And there could be different approaches and different handling of those. So, but in case, so the idea was for consistency reasons, one of them is mandatory, and the one that was the logical choice was the one that is more general for access URL. But if you have information about the exact location of the file, then you would also provide the download URL. It would mean that in some cases where there is a downloadable file, you might have two instances of the same thing. So the access URL and the download URL might have the same information. There is a guideline that was developed in the period that DCAT-AP was developed, and those are part of the guidelines for DCAT AP on join up, and this is the link to this issue and the explanation of that. The next one that is often something that people have questions about is the issue of contact information. Now, the idea is that in DCAT AP and in DCAT there are basically two objectives of linking to an organization, for example. For example, there is a publisher which connects to an agent, the organization that is responsible for the catalog, or an organization that publishes information about the data set. The contact point is a property that connects to contact information. So the objectives are different. This is a subtle difference, but it's crucial in the sense that the way that we describe agents with FOF, for example, or with something that is more elaborate, the W3C organization ontology. The description, the real important thing is that you know what the organization is. It will include identifying information for an organization, but it does not necessarily include contact information. On the other hand, the contact points are described using DCAT of the catalog, DCAT ontology, which means that a description must include contact information, and it may include other identifying information. This is a subtle difference, and it's sometimes hard to describe it. Remember that the important thing about contact points is that you get information about the contact, so the email, the telephone numbers, and not just name or those kind of things, which would be something that you provide using FOF or the W3C organization. Probably something that we might come back to later in later webinars. But, this is sort of the overall idea behind the content information. One thing that I needed to come back to, I said in earlier part of the presentation, that distribution is not mandatory in DCAT AP. And that is the reason for that is that there's not always data associated with the data set. So there's not always data that you can directly access. So there's two areas there. There is an area where the data cannot be accessed directly, but needs to be through some landing page, which is, for example, data for which registration is required. So data is there, you can get access, but not directly. You need to go through a landing page to request access. In the case of Copernicus, it's also to prevent high traffic because the files are quite big. But also there are data sets that are only available to researchers, so they're restricted access, and you have to go through a separate request for access. So in that sense, there might not be a distribution, but you might need to go through a landing page or some other reference to get access, and then maybe the access to the data is outside of the portal. The other thing is that there's actually no data at all, which are two cases. One case is that the data is not there yet. You could, for example, publish information about a data set before the data is collected. So you could, for example, the budget for next year, you could actually say that it will be available from September, but the data is not yet there. So there is no distribution there yet. It will become available at some point in the future. And also data that is archived. We always say that data, as long as it's useful, should remain available, but there are certainly cases where data is no longer relevant. Data is being archived or data has moved to another location. And that in that case, even if the data is no longer available, you would need to keep the metadata to actually give people also information of what happened to it. So there is something there that you have situations where there is a data set description, but the data is not there anymore, so there is no distribution. So that is two cases. Either you have to have a different way of accessing the data, or the data is not there, which was a reason for the distribution not to be mandatory in DCAT AP. That's the end. Any questions? Further questions? We wait for.
Yes, we have here a question from Carlos. In DCAT, it's still for the first part of the presentation.
Okay.
In DCAT IP, what's the difference between recommended and optional elements?
Well, the difference between those two is that if at all possible, if you are describing your information, your data sets, if at all possible, you should provide that information. So it's not if you don't have it, of course you cannot provide it, but if you have it, please provide it. As I said, it might be that not everybody, for example, in a network like around the European data portal, not everybody has that, so there might not, the information might not be there, but it is sort of an invitation to someone who produces the metadata to provide that information. Optional is basically, it's nice to have, but you cannot rely on it because it's quite clear that a lot of people will not be able to provide it. So it's an intention. Mandatory, you must do that. Recommended is please try as best you can to provide it. And the optional is, well, if you have it, you provide it. If you don't have it, don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Peter. Download URL. This is not for a dataset service that provides download depending on an individual request.
No, the download URL is actually for a downloadable file. So there was some confusion in DCAT version 1, the W3C, because the description of the download URL implied that it could be a link to a data service, but there were many problems identified with that, and that led to the definition of this new entity data service to remove the confusion there.
Okay, another question from David. What is the best, easiest way that one could start integrating or building an implementation of DCAT AP, at least to build a prototype or a minimum viable product? Are there tools or connectors for this or specific implementation-oriented guidelines?
Well, no, there are tools, of course, there are products that where you can that implement DCAT AP for you, and they have the tools that go around with that. There are things like if you have a CCAN, as we discussed last time, a CCAT catalog, there are tools that are able to map the data from a CCAN catalog to DCAT AP. So there are different things. I would say that there are products out there that implement DCAT AP, but guideline of how to implement DCAT AP is for this set of training is a little bit too far, but certainly if you want to be a part of the community that develops DCAT AP, there are the people there that will able to help you find the tools that you need to implement. And also, if you say you could do a demo to see how it works for you, I think that's sort of a sensible way of going about.
Okay, and another question from Xavier. For the example of Lustre JSON distribution on slide 24, do you recommend to use DCT title, JSON LD distribution of dataset, or it is better not to use title at all as the title seems redundant?
Yeah, that's a little bit the question of how you want to do that. It also depends a little bit on what kind of user interface you're expecting. I agree with you that in this case, if there is just a JSON file, just saying in the title that this is the JSON file is a little bit, as you say, redundant. Now, it is not redundant, of course, if a user looks at it. If you present that to the user and the user only sees a URL with JSON at the end, they may understand that it's a JSON file. But if you really want to help your user understanding what they're clicking on, then maybe you want to do that. But it's a little bit, in all cases, what information do you provide has to do with what information do you have, and how much money do you have to provide that information. But also very importantly, what do you want to show to your users and what do we want to be visible to help people. And it might be that there is some redundant information there for your user, but I think that's a decision that you need to take on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I think these are all the questions. I saw on the chat that Martin, you were asking for EU vocabularies, but we will pass this question to the EU vocabularies team because it's very technical. So I think it's better to have the answer written. Okay, and yeah, I don't see any more questions. So Max, you can maybe say some words about the third webinar.
Yeah, so we're having a third webinar, as you remember, on the 19th of April, also from 10 to 11:15. What we want to discuss in that webinar is about the extensions to DCAT-AP. We talked a little bit about that in the first webinar, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what these conformance rules are, how you can extend, what kind of considerations you have there. I want to talk a little bit about the influence that DCAT-AP has had and still has on DCAT and W3C. So things that come out of the experience of DCAT-AP that is fed back into DCAT. And then we want to discuss some possible solution to functional issues. And the functional issues that we want to discuss are things that we want you to suggest. So for the next webinar, we have here on the right-hand side, we have this Slido link. We have already received from the first webinar a number of suggestions of what we want to, what we could handle there. It will be still open until tomorrow at the end of the day, as we're going to decide on which issues we want to handle in the third webinar on Wednesday. So if you can provide your suggestions to the issues list, then we can make a selection. We're probably not going to be able to do all of them, so we will select 2 or 3 that look the most interesting. And then also we will provide some answers to your questions that we can provide also in the Slido. So that is for the next webinar. Tomorrow, provide us suggestions for the content of those functional issues. And then on the 19th of April, we will talk about those issues. And then again, to say that the access to webinars is on the YouTube channel of the publication topic, and I think in a couple of days you will also find the second webinar on YouTube. Agnieszka, you want to say the final words? You're muted.
Okay, so just a very quick thank you to all the participants, and thank you, Max, for an excellent presentation. And we hope to see you during the third webinar, the 19th of April.